You didn't scare him. You reflected something he's been running from his whole life. Why do the men who feel deeply seen by you always seem to disappear? If you don't understand this pattern, you'll keep blaming your softness, and you'll start shrinking the very energy that makes you whole. Carl Jung called it the anima, but no one talks about how your feminine energy can awaken not just his soul, but his shadow too. She wasn't trying to change him. Elena was just showing up, present, intuitive, vulnerable in a way that felt like coming home. And that scared him more than any confrontation, any argument, any dramatic ultimatum ever could. He didn't ghost because she was too much. He didn't pull away because she was clingy or needy or demanding. He left because she mirrored the part of him he couldn't yet meet. The wounded anima, the abandoned feminine, the soft places in his soul that had been shamed into hiding since childhood. Carl Jung's shadow work helps us understand that when the feminine becomes a mirror, not of seduction, but of safety, it often awakens what a man has buried to survive. And that kind of reflection doesn't feel like love to someone who has only ever known attachment through pain. It feels like exposure. You know this pattern intimately, don't you? You've lived it more times than you care to count. You opened your heart completely, held space without demands or expectations, didn't chase or manipulate or play games. You showed up as the most authentic version of yourself, thinking that surely this time, with this person, your realness would be welcomed. But instead of drawing him closer, instead of deepening the connection, you triggered something primal, a withdrawal so sudden it left you questioning everything. A shutdown so complete it felt like emotional whiplash. Or worse, a cold indifference masked as masculine strength, leaving you wondering if you'd imagined the intimacy entirely. It's not rejection, it's reflection. You just became a screen for his unprocessed emotional chaos. And no one taught you how to survive that intensity, how to protect your energy from becoming the container for someone else's shadow material. This is where most women blame themselves completely, dissecting every word, every gesture, every moment of vulnerability, wondering if they were too available, too honest, too real, too much of everything that makes them beautifully human. But what if the reaction you triggered wasn't personal, but archetypal? What if your feminine energy awakened something in him that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with wounds that were carved into his psyche long before you ever existed? Carl Jung described the anima as the unconscious feminine inside every man, the intuitive, emotional, feeling side he must learn to integrate to become a whole human being. But when that integration hasn't happened, when childhood wounds and cultural conditioning have severed him from his inner feminine, he projects that anima outward onto you. And depending on the depth of the wound, the severity of the disconnection, he either worships, idealizes, or fears what you represent with an intensity that can feel overwhelming. It's like standing in front of a funhouse mirror, and instead of seeing you clearly, your complexity, your humanity, your individual beauty, he sees everything he was told not to be, everything that was shamed out of him. Emotional, uncertain, soft, receptive, cyclical, intuitive, and unconsciously, often without any awareness of what he's doing, he punishes you for it. Not because of who you are, but because of what your energy reveals in him. Think about Jordan's story. From the outside, he appeared to be exactly the kind of man who would appreciate depth. He was drawn to women who felt deeply, who could navigate the emotional landscapes he'd been taught to avoid since childhood. He read the right books, used the right language, spoke beautifully about consciousness and growth. But there was a split inside him that he couldn't see. His father had called his tears weakness from the time he was old enough to feel pain. His mother, overwhelmed by her own unhealed trauma, had labeled his sensitivity too much whenever he needed comfort or connection. So Jordan learned to bury these parts of himself so deep that he forgot they existed. He developed a sophisticated persona, intelligent, successful, emotionally articulate. But underneath, his inner feminine remained wounded and exiled. The moment a woman showed him that same depth in himself, reflected his tears he'd never allowed himself to cry, his tenderness he'd armored against, his need for emotional intimacy he'd learned to call weakness. He would disappear. Not because they were wrong for him, because they were right in a way that terrified his entire constructed identity. Your authentic feminine presence, not your performance, not your people-pleasing, not the version of yourself you think others want, becomes unbearable for the man who still shames his own softness. The woman who trusts her intuition triggers the man who was taught to only trust logic and external validation. The woman who honors her emotional cycles mirrors back to him every natural rhythm he was forced to suppress to survive in a world that demands constant productivity and emotional numbness. You may think, if I were less emotional, less intuitive, less intense, if I could just learn to be more logical, more contained, more like what he seems to want, maybe he'd stay. But that's not healing. That's self-erasure. That's spiritual suicide. That's abandoning the very essence of what makes you who you are. The feminine energy that flows through you, the same energy that creates life, that heals through presence alone, that sees beyond surface appearances into the truth of things, doesn't need to be dimmed, managed, or carefully rationed out. It needs to be understood, honored, and protected. Because when you carry this energy authentically, without apology or explanation, you become a walking invitation for others to remember what they've forgotten about themselves. And for the man who's still at war with his own feminine nature, that invitation feels like a threat to everything he thinks makes him strong, worthy, or lovable. But here's what's devastating about this pattern. You'll start to internalize his fear. You'll begin to see your depth as a flaw, your intuition as too much, your emotional wisdom as a burden others must carry. You'll start performing a smaller, safer version of yourself, hoping that if you just dim your light enough, if you just need less, feel less, want less, someone will finally be able to look at you without running. This is how women lose themselves, not through one dramatic moment, but through 1,000 tiny compromises, 1,000 small betrayals of their own nature, 1,000 moments of choosing someone else's comfort over their own authenticity. He didn't leave because you were too much. He left because you touched the part of him that's never been loved, not by anyone, not even by himself. The feminine energy you carry, when it's raw, honest, cyclical, and real, doesn't just awaken his longing for connection and intimacy. It awakens his shame about his own emotional needs, his terror of vulnerability, his unhealed relationship with his mother, his fear of being consumed, controlled, or abandoned. And sometimes, most painfully, it awakens the shadow Anima, the manipulative, possessive, or wounded feminine projection he hasn't learned to integrate. Without knowing it, without any conscious awareness of the dynamic playing out, you become the battleground between his yearning for the sacred feminine and his terror of everything it represents in his psyche. Consider Mia's story, because I know you'll recognize yourself in her experience. She was dating a man who spoke beautifully about emotional depth, who claimed he wanted a conscious relationship, who could quote spiritual teachers about divine feminine energy and sacred union. He had all the right words, all the right intentions. On paper, he was everything she'd been seeking. But every time she shared her real feelings, not the polished, digestible version she thought he wanted to hear, but the raw, unfiltered truth of her experience, he would shut down completely. His energy would shift so dramatically it felt like being with a completely different person. He'd accuse her of being too intense or creating drama where none existed. His voice would take on that cold, rational tone that felt like emotional violence, like being slapped for the crime of having feelings. What Mia didn't realize, what took her months of therapy to understand, was that her emotional authenticity was triggering his completely unhealed relationship with his own inner feminine. His mother had been emotionally volatile and unpredictable, swinging between suffocating closeness and cold rejection. He'd learned to associate feminine emotional expression with chaos, manipulation, and the threat of being emotionally consumed. So when Mia would cry, not manipulatively, not to get something from him, but simply because she felt sad or overwhelmed. He didn't see her pain. He saw his mother's unprocessed rage, her emotional instability, her tendency to make everything about her. When Mia would share her intuitive concerns about their relationship, when she'd gently bring up patterns she was noticing, he didn't hear her wisdom or her care. He heard his mother's accusations, her emotional manipulation, her way of making him responsible for her feelings. Mia had become the screen onto which he projected every unhealed wound he carried with the feminine. She wasn't a person to him in those moments. She was a symbol, a trigger, a repository for everything he feared about emotional intimacy. This is the moment most women overextend themselves completely. The moment when love becomes self-harm. If I just love him enough, if I stay patient enough, if I can explain my feelings more clearly, maybe soften my approach, maybe give him more space while also showing up more consistently, maybe heal my own wounds faster, some less triggering. But love cannot save what shadow still controls. Patience cannot heal what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. And your pain will keep deepening. Your sense of self will keep eroding until you realize this devastating truth. You were never meant to carry his anima. The anima wound runs deeper than individual relationships, deeper than personal history. It's not just about this one man, or even men in general. It's about generations of human beings who were taught that their sensitivity was a liability, their intuition was untrustworthy, their emotional nature was something to be conquered rather than integrated into wholeness. We live in a culture that has systematically severed the masculine from its feeling nature, that has taught men to see emotions as weakness and vulnerability as danger. The result is a collective wound so deep that when healthy feminine energy appears, energy that feels, that flows, that trusts its inner knowing, it can trigger an existential crisis in those who have been cut off from these qualities in themselves. When your feminine energy is healthy and whole, when it's connected to your authentic self rather than your wounded need to be chosen or validated, it becomes a mirror for everything unhealed in another person's relationship with their own inner feminine. Your presence alone, not what you do or say or offer, but the energy you emanate simply by being yourself, can trigger an existential crisis in someone who's never learned to love their own depth. And here's what breaks my heart about this pattern, what makes me want to reach through these words and hold every woman who's lived this. You'll start to believe it's your fault. You'll start to think your energy is the problem, your intuition is wrong, your emotional nature is a burden others must carry. You'll begin to see your gifts as curses, your depth as drama, your sensitivity as weakness. But your feminine energy isn't the problem. The problem is a culture that taught him to fear the very qualities that would make him whole. The problem is a wounded masculine that sees feminine emotional wisdom as chaos rather than guidance. The problem is an unconscious man projecting his unhealed anima onto every woman brave enough to show up authentically. You cannot love someone into wholeness. You cannot feminine energy someone into consciousness. You cannot heal someone's mother wound by becoming a different kind of mother. And you cannot sacrifice your authenticity to make someone else comfortable with their own shadows. The moment you try, you stop being a woman in relationship and become a therapist, a mother, a wound healer. And that's not love. That's codependence dressed up as spirituality. Think of the woman who finally stopped chasing emotional potential. She didn't become hard or closed off or cynical about love. She became sovereign. She realized she had confused being the mirror with being the medicine. You were not created to rescue what a man refuses to recognize in himself. Your presence may awaken him to his unlived life, his abandoned sensitivity, his disconnected heart. But your disappearance may be the only thing that invites him to finally face himself without using you as an emotional crutch. This is where the real transformation begins. Not in him, in you. Not in fixing what's broken in the masculine, but in reclaiming what's been abandoned, dismissed, or sacrificed in your own feminine nature. This is the essence of Carl Jung's shadow work in relationships. Not about fixing others, but about withdrawing from the roles that were never yours to carry. There's a profound difference between offering your feminine energy as a gift and using it as a tool to be chosen. When you're truly embodying your feminine essence, you're not performing it for approval or acceptance. You're not wielding it strategically to get love or security. You're living it because it's the most authentic expression of who you are when you're not trying to be anything for anyone else. Let me tell you about Carmen's awakening, because her story might illuminate something you need to hear. She spent years in relationships where she felt like she was constantly auditioning for love, constantly proving her worthiness through emotional labor. She would soften her edges when they felt threatening to fragile masculinity, dim her intuition when it made men uncomfortable with their own disconnection, and suppress her emotional truth to keep everyone around her regulated and calm. She became a master at reading the room, at sensing what version of herself would be most acceptable in any given moment. She could modulate her energy like a thermostat, making herself smaller when someone needed to feel bigger, dimming her light when someone else's insecurity demanded it. But every relationship ended the same way, with her feeling completely unseen, unmet, and emotionally exhausted, while they felt suffocated by expectations they never consciously asked for, but that her sacrifices had created. She was tired of being everyone's emotional regulator, exhausted from making herself small so others could feel big, resentful of always having to be the one who understood, who gave space, who held it all together. The turning point came during a particularly painful breakup, when she realized she'd been trying to love men into loving themselves. She'd been using her feminine energy like a healing balm, constantly pouring herself out to soothe their Anima wounds, their mother issues, their fear of feeling deeply. But healing doesn't work that way. You can't give someone self-love. You can't do someone else's inner work for them. You can only model what it looks like to love yourself fully, to honor your own nature completely. Carmen began to understand that every time she dimmed her energy to accommodate someone's discomfort, she was actually enabling their unconsciousness. She was making it easier for them to avoid their own inner work by becoming the container for everything they couldn't hold themselves. She was preventing their growth by being too willing to shrink. He will resist this shift in you. He may blame you for changing, for becoming selfish or cold or impossible to please. He might even try to convince you that you're the problem, that your standards are too high, that you're being unrealistic about love, that you're asking for too much. These accusations will sting because they'll hit your deepest fears about yourself. But the deeper truth is this: until his inner feminine is healed, until he's done the work of integrating his own anima, until he's learned to love his own emotional nature, he cannot hold the wholeness of yours. This doesn't make him a bad person. This makes him unconscious. And consciousness cannot be forced, convinced, or loved into someone. It can only be invited. But that invitation must come from his own inner longing for wholeness, not from your emotional labor or sacrifice. When you stop trying to heal his animal wound and start protecting your own feminine energy, something shifts in the entire dynamic between you. You're no longer available for projections. You're no longer willing to be the container for someone else's unprocessed emotions. You stop being the therapist, the mother, the emotional regulator, the wound healer. And paradoxically, this is when you become truly magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract anyone, not because you're using your energy strategically, but because you're finally fully yourself. Your wholeness becomes its own invitation. Not an invitation to be fixed or saved or completed, but an invitation to remember, to come home to the parts of themselves they've been running from. Some will accept that invitation and do the inner work required to meet you in your fullness. They'll face their Anima wounds, integrate their emotional nature, and learn to love the feminine within themselves. Others will run further into unconsciousness, seeking someone more willing to carry their projections, someone more available for their healing fantasies. But that's no longer your concern. Your only job is to remain true to the energy that flows through you, to honor your own nature completely. regardless of who can or cannot handle its intensity or depth. So how do you reclaim your feminine energy after it's been punished, blamed, shamed, or abandoned? You stop performing it. You stop using it to get chosen, and you start living it, even when no one knows how to receive it gracefully. Feminine energy is the forest that doesn't apologize for its wildness, the moon that doesn't dim itself for those who prefer artificial light, the tide that doesn't ask permission to change. It doesn't demand or chase or fix. It reveals truth. It invites depth. It stirs what's been sleeping. And then it lets go of the outcome completely. This is perhaps the hardest lesson for women who've been conditioned to be the emotional caretakers of the world, who've been taught that love means sacrificing yourself for others' comfort, learning to let go of the outcome. Your feminine energy is not a strategy for getting love. It's not a tool for healing others. It's not a bargaining chip in the game of relationships. It's the most natural expression of who you are when you're not trying to be anything for anyone else. When you were a child, before the world taught you to be careful with your emotions, before you learned that your feelings were too much or too intense or too inconvenient, you felt everything fully. You cried when you were sad, laughed when you were joyful, and loved without conditions or strategies or protection. You trusted your body's wisdom, followed your curiosity wherever it led, and expressed your truth without editing it for others' comfort. That wasn't immaturity, that was wholeness. The return isn't about becoming that child again, about being naive or unprotected in a world that can be harsh. It's about integrating that child's emotional freedom with your adult wisdom. It's about honoring your natural cycles, trusting your intuitive guidance, and feeling deeply without making it anyone else's responsibility to manage, fix, or heal your emotions. Think about Rebecca's journey, because it might mirror your own path home to yourself. After years of relationships where she felt like she had to earn love through emotional caretaking, through being endlessly understanding and patient and available, she decided to take a complete break from dating. Not because she was angry or hurt or traumatized, but because she wanted to remember who she was when she wasn't trying to be someone's Anima projection. She started paying attention to her natural rhythms again, the ones she'd learned to override for others' convenience. She noticed when she needed solitude and when she craved connection. She honored her intuitive hits instead of explaining them away with logic or dismissing them as too sensitive. She let herself feel her emotions fully without immediately trying to process them with someone else or turn them into learning experiences or spiritual growth opportunities. What she discovered was revolutionary. Her feminine energy wasn't something she had to manage, control, or carefully ration out to make others comfortable. It was something she could trust completely, something that had its own intelligence, its own timing, its own perfect rhythm. She learned to feel her anger without becoming aggressive or destructive, to feel her sadness without becoming depressive or self-pitying, to feel her joy without needing to tone it down for others' comfort or insecurity. She rediscovered the power of her no and the sacred nature of her yes. Most importantly, she stopped looking to others to validate her emotional reality. She didn't need anyone to understand her cycles, her intuition, or her depth. She didn't need anyone to appreciate her sensitivity or celebrate her emotional intelligence. She simply honored them as the natural expressions of her feminine essence. You don't owe your presence to anyone who hasn't earned the capacity to hold it. You don't have to dim your light to make someone else comfortable with their own shadows. You don't have to slow down for people who refuse to keep up. And you certainly don't have to heal anyone's anima wound to be worthy of love. Your feminine energy is not a performance you put on for others' entertainment. It's not a gift you give to others hoping for reciprocation or appreciation. It's not a service you provide to help others feel better about themselves. It's the very essence of who you are, and it deserves to be honored, protected, and celebrated, regardless of who can or cannot receive it gracefully. When you truly return to yourself, when you stop looking outside for permission to be who you are, you stop asking, "Why can't he handle my energy?" and start asking, "How can I honor this energy more fully?" The shift changes everything. You stop seeking permission to be yourself and start giving yourself the permission you've been waiting for your whole life. You begin to see that your emotional depth isn't drama, it's wisdom. Your intuition isn't too much, it's guidance. Your sensitivity isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. Your cycles aren't inconvenient. They're sacred rhythms that connect you to the natural world and the cosmic order. This is when you become dangerous to unconsciousness everywhere. Not because you're angry or vengeful or bitter, but because you're awake. You refuse to shrink. You refuse to carry what isn't yours. You refuse to apologize for the very energy that makes you whole. There's a quiet power in the woman who stops asking, "What did I do wrong?" and starts asking, "What did I awaken in him that he wasn't ready for?" This isn't about blame or making anyone wrong or positioning yourself as superior. It's about understanding the deeper psychological and spiritual dynamics at play when authentic feminine energy meets unhealed masculine consciousness. It's about recognizing that your feminine energy, in all its depth, intuition, emotional truth, and cyclical wisdom, is not a problem to be solved, a flaw to be fixed, or a burden to be carried. It's a force to be honored, celebrated, and protected. This is the terrain of Carl Jung's shadow work, where what you awaken in others is often their unintegrated unconscious, and where their resistance isn't a verdict on your worth, but a mirror of their fear. If this spoke to something you've lived, a connection that broke you open, not because of what happened between you, but because of what you reflected back to someone who couldn't handle their own reflection, then you're not alone in this experience. There are countless women who've confused being a mirror with being medicine, who've tried to love men into wholeness, who've dimmed their radiant light to keep others comfortable in their emotional darkness. But your light was never meant to be comfortable for unconsciousness. It was never meant to make everyone feel safe and regulated and unthreatened. Your light was meant to be true, to be real, to be unapologetically, authentically you. Your feminine energy is a portal, a gateway to depth, intuition, authentic connection, and the sacred wisdom that lives in your bones, in your blood, in your very cellular structure. It connects you to the earth, to the moon, to the ancient knowledge of what it means to be fully alive. It deserves to be protected fiercely, celebrated completely, and expressed fully, regardless of who can or cannot handle its transformative power. Leave a comment below with the word mirror if you've ever loved someone who couldn't stay because you showed them too much of their own soul. Let's create a space where these experiences can be witnessed, honored, and transformed into wisdom rather than wounds. Protect your feminine energy fiercely, honor it completely, and never, ever shrink it to be understood by someone still afraid of their own depth, their own feeling nature, their own beautiful, messy, complicated humanity. The world needs your full feminine expression, not the dimmed version that makes others comfortable, not the careful version that never threatens anyone's sleep or challenges anyone's numbness. Not the performed version that gets you chosen or approved of. The real, raw, revolutionary version that reminds everyone what it means to be truly alive, deeply feeling, and courageously authentic in a world that often rewards emotional numbness. You're not too much. You have never been too much. You will never be too much. You are exactly the right amount of everything this sleeping world needs to wake up from its emotional coma and remember what it means to feel fully alive, to love without conditions, to trust the wisdom that flows through you when you're brave enough to be completely yourself. Your feminine energy is not a mistake. It's not an accident. It's not something that needs to be fixed, managed, or apologized for. It's a gift to this world, and it's time you started treating it as such.